Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back to the World Builder's Anvil. Once again, I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram, and I'm glad to have you here for this exciting topic of maps. And if you don't like maps, you should. Go Google Maps, go look at maps. Maps are wonderful. Nothing will tell you more about geography and where and why things exist than looking at maps, especially from the times and places you're looking at. If you want to do medieval, go look at some medieval maps. What do they look like? They're not going to look like the maps we use today. The maps we use for today are utility, and it's, I think, good to know the utility side of it as the person who runs the world. But when you deliver maps to people, it's not going to look the same as the maps that you have in the background. One, there might be things that you don't want other people to see. Or two, the people who are delivering the map probably don't know the level of detail that you do about the world. If you look at old maps, the insides look funny. It's like the coastlines get very detailed and the insides get real vague. And part of the problem was, one of the issues, I think, for a long period of time was doing good surveying over land. Now, the Romans were pretty good at surveying, but that technology was kind of lost when the empire fell. And even that, there's a lot of land to survey, so exactly how far the mountains are away, things seem bigger because we're small than they really are sometimes. So the maps are going to be skewed based off the perspective of the people delivering them. And they might do them in different ways. Or they might have star charts. You might have an ancient culture that has a star chart because they're charting what they see happen to the stars ahead of them. They don't know the distance, or they probably don't know the distance to the star, but they know where it's at a certain time. And that, for some cultures who get star obsessed, that's very important to know when stars are where. Because that tells them something of what's going to happen in just a few days. And whether or not the culture knows, let's say, for example, you might have a priestly cast of astrologers in your culture. They might use the stars to make predictions of things to come. And if the people don't catch on with the stars moving, you might have temples set up that have strange holes in the roofs, and if you stand at the position of the priest, you can sit there and look up, raise your hands up, and see 3 different holes, and if the stars are in those holes, you say 3 months of cold is about to come. Because when those 3 stars are in that position, it's always the indication that winter is coming. People would probably know that winter is somewhere around the veil, but if you had 3 stars that lined up and told you from the perspective of your culture when winter's coming, that's a very useful thing early on. Most people who are lagging getting the crops up are going to have to rush. Or they're going to have to make sure they have all of the preparations ready if it's a place with a lot of cold winter. Or maybe it's just a wet season if it's somewhere else in the hotter part of the world. But stars can be very telling. But stars, unlike the crust of the earth, they change their position a little more frequently. So that trick might work for a couple hundred years, but it'll start to shift just enough that the holes in your roof probably won't be in the right place anymore. However, there might be ways of the culture dealing with that. Maybe new stars take the place of the old ones. Maybe there are other things that happen, but just be wary that over the time frame of a couple hundred years, especially over a couple thousand years, where the astrological signs are today are not where they were when the ancient Greeks used them. In the terms of the cosmos, they're less meaningful today for what they used to be. Now, another important thing is what language the map be. And that can be based from the culture you're dealing with. Probably early on, they're going to be very, very protective of maps. Maps give you important information where you are, or maybe you have troops positioned, where your fortifications are. These are things you don't want your enemy to find out. Maps would probably be very jealously guarded if they're created by a society. The language will probably be their language, maybe even encoded somehow. A simple cipher. Simple ciphers go back a very long time, and they probably go back for maps as far as anything else. The whole idea of signals and codes came out of the army from the military, I should say, from at least the time of the Romans, probably before. Because the harder it is for the enemies to read the important things, the better. However, you might not want to present it that way when you give it to readers. Maybe you present it in English, or maybe if you create a language for a culture, maybe you want to show off the thing, so you kind of put it in the base language of the culture to say, this is that kingdom, this is that city, this is this principality, this is that empire. That's a decision you're going to make when you share it with your players, but for purposes of the story, remember, maps are probably going to be very tightly guarded. If you're trying to map something out and the local rulers find out about it, if you're not working for them, they are probably going to kill you. Nothing personal against you. That information is very, very important. If there's an area with invasion a lot, you're probably going to have very messy streets. So even you're not going to see street signs up. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be easy to get lost in cities that are really worried about being invaded. Cities that are less worried about being invaded are more likely to be in a grid system. Like the Romans built grid system cities. And if you go to like a city like Florence in Italy, if you go back to the old Roman Forum area in the center of Tuscany, or in the center of Florence, it's a grid. And trust me, you get out of that for 10 steps, and it becomes the most winding, difficult to find your way around town that you've been in until you go to the next town in Italy. These cities were being invaded all the time, and the streets showed it. Realize that when this goes back to your world, especially off of the main avenues, if there's urban planning, it would not be to make it easy. It would probably be to make it defendable. And the more defendable your city is, once the walls have been breached, the better off the defenders are, the more likely the rulers are to exist. Mapping this, if you're not the ruler, is going to be a very serious offense probably. And for the ruler, when you do have it mapped, this will be one of your top documents to protect. If you were an old sea captain during the age of colonization and the English took your maps, that might have been as bad as a military unit losing their colors on the battlefield, which can disgrace or permanently remove that military unit from a military unit status forever for a country. Military colors, that's more of a symbolic thing. Maps are a real punishment if your enemy get a hold of these. So they're probably very tightly concealed. And it's a good story of espionage is to send someone into your foe's city or castle and bring them back a map. You're essentially a spy. So there are some interesting stories you could do around maps, because maps are vitally important. They tell you how and where those trading cities are. What are the currents to use if it's an ocean-going map? Where are the oases along the path? You don't want your competition to know, because maybe you can get through that land caravan 2 weeks faster and no one knows how, because you know of a different spring that no one knows of. Or a city will let you into it and your other friends from your culture can't go into that city. So it's very important to understand this information will be deeply a guarded secret. It's probably only in more recent times where you start to get to a more utilitarian fashion. And now with satellites, Afghanistan can protect the maps all they want, but we can map it out ourselves from space. So there is a transition to where maps become less important, but you'd be shocked. It's probably closer to today than it was even 500 years ago. 500 years ago, you still probably be killed for playing around with the wrong kinds of maps. Now, there could be artistic maps that are shared out with, this is the map of the known world, stuff like that, but especially detailed maps that have valuable information are going to be under lock and key and probably very difficult to read, even if you know the language of the target. Now, what kind of maps do I use and why? I use basic maps to cover major political settlements. If I'm doing a specific story and I'm going to share a map out with it, I will actually put some smaller settlements in there too. But the problem with maps is they don't typically deal with over time. So if I really want to get detailed for something, I will I'll save a copy of my map for that period of time, and I'll put more information on it than it would normally have. I usually use things like PowerPoint to show boundaries, because it's kind of easy to draw a translucent boundary for a certain time period in PowerPoint. And I'll print a JPEG out of my map from my software. I'll bring it into PowerPoint. And I'll just sort of put these translucent boxes to show this is this kingdom, this is that kingdom. They're meant more for the people using the world's information. Sometimes I make maps out internally for the game, but that's rare because once again, maps are important, meaningful things. And it's unlikely that they're going to let these things be put at risk. And I do it because I like maps. So whether it's a little bit more artistic thing that I want to share out when I release a story, or I want players to use if I'm running a role-playing game, I'll do those. And I'll usually use English as the language. However, that might not always be true. Sometimes I'll use a language I've made up as well. And it'll show, one, the thoughtfulness I put into my world. There's some pride there. So part of it's that too, but it's to help stress the point that this is not Earth. And the way my world's designed is to help bring people into fantasy. So when I start stories with new people, it's usually very light on magic and on non-human-like creatures. And they'll start getting bits and pieces fed to them, and it will build up to a full-fledged fantasy world. I wouldn't say quite high fantasy, but pretty close to high fantasy. Magic's pretty prevalent in my world, and the limitations to it aren't so overburdening that it would be unusual to see 1 out of 10 people having magic. Now, the rating for this topic is basic. You need to know maps, and I've already given you a couple map tasks, but guess what your map task for the day is? I'm sorry, your world building task for the day is. The last task you had was to compare your map with a map you had drawn up and a map of Earth. Now look again at your world, look at Earth, look at this other map you've done and say, right now, before I publish stuff, before I start really sharing it with the world, are there any geographical changes I need to account for things in my cultures? Do I not have enough land to have an Asian-style climate for my Mongol-style riders? Do I not have a hilly, kind of barren location far north for my Viking-style race? If you don't have those things, build them in, because the further the geography gets away from the style of culture you're trying to mimic, the harder it is to make it believable. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's easier to recreate the kinds of conditions you want climate and weather-wise to create the kinds of cultures that resulted in reality. Because people have real-life things they can tie it back to. Now, don't just copy and paste the culture, but the closer it is aligned to these other cultures that have existed, the closer your geography should probably be in line too. The real-world task for the day. This is back to my favorite. If you've been listening to all the episodes, you've heard this one, I think, 2 other times already. Write a note to your significant other, hide it somewhere, and they can find it, and they can have a little bit better day the day they find it. Don't hide it too hard, but don't just put it on the bureau. Put it in a book they're reading. Put it in a drawer with the knives. Put it somewhere where they'll bump into it and derive pleasure from it at a different time than when you wrote it. And now the tease for the next episode is natural wonders. And we'll kind of go into some specific ones from Earth and some ones that I've just kind of thought up randomly. Some might or might not exist in my world, but just different kinds of things that I think might really stick out in the minds of cultures where I know they have, or I think they might. So we'll go over some specific examples of actual wonders of the world and the influence they have on cultures. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.